Thank you so much, Dr. Elia Magan, for this transition. And thank you so much for moderating the previous session. And thank you also, once again, Dr. Agus Santoso, for the presentation. Really wonderful presentation regarding the apocalyptic layer in the book of Job. And we'll continue to the next session from my friend Aleksandar Danilovic from Heidelberg University. He's a really great guy, my best friend in Heidelberg. We've been doing a lot of things together in our studies. And he's also going to do a theme, a presentation on a theme that also has to do with apocalyptic, which is resurrection in this book of 2 Maccabees. And before he presents his materials, I would like to introduce Alex regarding his curriculum vitae. Aleksandar Danilovic, next, has studied in Valjevo Gymnasium from 2008 to 2012, and he also studied at the Orthodox Theological Faculty at the University of Belgrade in general program, 2012 to 2016, and he also took educational program Politicas, Belgrade Open School, and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, 2016 to 2017. And he also studied Orthodox Theological Faculty at the University of Belgrade, a Biblical Patristic Module, Master's Degree, 2016 to 17, and also at the University of Heidelberg, Utrecht Universität, Heidelberg, on Christianity and Culture, Master's Degree with his master's thesis on the second Maccabees 7 and the early church reception. And he's also doing his PhD and finishing his studies with the dissertation topic, The Golden Bridge, the second book of Maccabees, is theology and its status in the biblical canon. And he's doing that in at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. And next, he also did some volunteers and also received some scholarships, and also did working experiences there for the Old Testament at the University of Heidelberg. And also he has scholarship from the EKD, and also scholarship holder of other scholarship programs, or to develop Bread for the World Foundation and Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, and also worked at the Biblical Institute of Orthodox Theological Faculty. And he also did Radiosendung Theorie des Wissenschaftsprogramms from Radio Solvol Ljubje. And also many publications that he already did. The recent one, 2024, in English, on the Eve of War, the Jerusalem Gymnasium. Second Maccabee 4, verses 7 to 15, will be published in the Welt des Orients, Göttingen. And also 2023, some other publications he already did. There are many of them, and the last one, I think, 2020, and so many other publications that my friend Aleksandar Danilovic already published. And he's a very diligent and productive scholar, and an Orthodox scholar, biblical Orthodox scholar. Is very expert in the book of Maccabee. And the time is yours for the presentation. Please, you can also share your screen. Alex, the podium and time is yours, please.
Thank you. I hope you guys can hear me. Thank you, Jenry, for this beautiful introduction. I'll now share my screen. I hope you guys can see it. Yeah. Should be able now to see it in full screen. Nice. So, dear ladies and gentlemen, firstly, Thank you very much for having me here, because it is an honor to speak here in front of you. As mentioned, my name is Aleksandar Danilovic, currently at the University of Heidelberg. Originally, I'm from Serbia, where I, as Jenry said, graduated at the Faculty of Orthodox Theology. So my denominational background is Orthodox Christianity. And the topic of my today's paper will be a small portion of my PhD thesis or project, and it will deal with the second book of Maccabees and its concept of the faith and resurrection. Firstly, the second book of Maccabees tells a story about the beginnings of the Judean uprising against the Seleucid Empire, and it was written in very good Greek somewhere around the mid-2nd century BC. It is composed in form of history of the beginnings of the Maccabean uprising. However, it does contain many important theological explanations that the book may be well seen as a form of Jewish educational literature during Hellenistic times, that is, some sort of the exegesis of the law and the prophets, which stood opposed to the Greek educational literature personified in the works of, for example, Homer, Herodotus, and others. Now, if you take a look at the most modern, well, at least Western and English-speaking biblical introduction textbooks, you will read that the Second Maccabees is an apocryphal book for the Protestants and that it belongs to the canon of the Holy Scriptures for Catholics and for the Orthodox Church. However, I have to add that for the Orthodox, its status is ambiguous because there are no official church decisions generally concerning the exact canon of the Old Testament writings, and the church holds for valid decisions of the local and ecumenical councils of the first millennia, which again are not entirely clear. So especially concerning Second Maccabees, some counts it as a canonical book while others don't mention it at all. And it is, however, for me important to stress that there is no council decision of the undivided church that excludes Second Maccabees from the Holy Scripture, as it is case with some other books, such as the Book of Tobit, Book of Judith, even canonical Book of Esther or Book of Revelation from the New Testament. They're just silent. So either it's in or it's not mentioned at all. One of the first who openly challenged Second Maccabees as a biblical book was Martin Luther. And even though he translated Second Maccabees and called it useful in his biblical introductions, in his Table Talks from 1533, he said that he was so hostile to Second Maccabees, you can see this quote here, he was so hostile to Second Maccabees and Book of Esther that he wished it did not exist, for they showed too much, and I quote, too much Jewishness and contain a lot of pagan improprieties. However, as far as I know, he did not go further elaborating why and what is exactly the problem with Second Maccabees or explaining this a sentence further. On the other hand, John Calvin went even further by stating that the ancient church did not read or use Second Maccabees at all. I'd say a very problematic statement, considering that it was based only on some paragraphs from the work Exposition of the Symbol by Pseudo-Cyprian. Nevertheless, unlike Luther, Calvin did express his dissatisfaction with Second Maccabees 12 and the concept of the prayer for the dead, which unfortunately some Catholics, I would say, abused and misused in order to justify their teachings of indulgences and purgatory. As a reaction, Catholics included Old Disputed book in their Bibles in the Council of Trent in 1546, again without any further discussion on the books themselves, just considering and condemning the decisions of the reformers. On the other hand, the Orthodox stayed away from this dispute because of various historical reasons, but they weren't left uninfluenced. So those who were later closer to the Protestants opted for the narrow canon, while those closer to the Catholics kept the wider canon, and thus Second Maccabees with it. Now, concluding this, my opinion is that the decision for the wider or narrow canon were conditioned more by historical consequences of the Reformation in the West than by some theological or biblical discussion, and the latter, if it occurred at all, came more as justification for the previously anchored historical positions. And this is why I decided to try to open this topic and to examine Second Maccabees in its theological core, which contains, maybe for the first time in biblical literature, and I underline explicit ideas of the most important Christian theological doctrine, and that is the faith and resurrection. Besides that, it contains other important theological moments such as temple theology, development in festivals, that is origins of Hanukkah, prayers, martyrdom, as well as the first explicit statement of the creation of the world out of nothing, that is creatio ex nihilo. And my attempt, generally my PhD thesis, is to examine if Second Maccabees represent both kind of historical and theological bridge between the events from the book, from the end of the book of Nehemiah and those from the beginning of the Gospels, thus covering the void of almost few centuries. Now, concerning resurrection, already Deuteronomy 32:39 proclaimed that God is the one who both kills and revives. Similarly, in the New Testament, Paul's assertion formed the foundation of Christian faith when he stated that if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then our preaching has been in vain and your faith has been in vain. Additionally, a comparable concept is evident in Talmudic literature. The so-called tractate Sanhedrin emphasized that there is no share in a world to come for those who deny the resurrection of the dead as derived from the Torah. So this underscores the belief in resurrection as a core element of both Christianity and Judaism, most likely very close connected to the concept of martyrdom, another important yet present Second Maccabees, according to which dying for one's faith is meaningful only when coupled with the belief in some form of reward after death. So this expression of faith is predominantly depicted in the central part of Second Maccabees, particularly in chapter 7, which recounts the martyrdom of the mother and her 7 sons, and it recurs in the accounts of Judah and his men in chapter 12, and a brief narrative concerning certain Razis from the chapter 14. However, what precisely does Second Maccabees articulate regarding this topic? How and why did it came to such an explicit expression of faith in the resurrection of the dead, potentially for the first time in biblical literature? And what were the developmental trajectories of this concept, both within the biblical tradition and beyond? That is this faith inherited from within the Old Testament tradition or from some external cultures? And finally, could such texts have facilitated an understanding of the Christ's resurrection for the first century audience and subsequent generation? Now, death as an entity both unknown and profoundly intimidating has persistently posed a challenge for humanity. So the concept that death as a termination of life is overcome through resurrection is widely distributed through Christian teachings of Pascha, and within this framework, Christian perceived the resurrection as a miraculous event through which God, the giver of life and the resurrection himself, according to John, the Gospel of John, who rose from the dead, he will resurrect his people, and through them, according to Revelation, entire creation. Now, following this, S.T. Davis offered a basic definition of resurrection as a miraculous revival from the dead by God, where he articulates 4 premises regarding Christian understanding of the resurrection, and that is, number 1, the existence of God. Then God is the one who resurrects. Number 3, resurrection is not immaterial but bodily. And number 4, the resurrected individual remain the same person, not some sort of replica or doppelganger. On the other hand, there have been numerous critiques on the beliefs of resurrection. Among them is the famous German philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach, who dismissed the concept of resurrection on psychological grounds, characterizing it as a means of evading the reality of death with certain religious communities, especially targeting Christians. And for Feuerbach, a resurrection represented a psychological projection that functions as a defense mechanism against death. So he contends that the notion of Christ's resurrection is merely a reflection of human yearning for the assurance of personal immortality. However, this perspective strongly echoes certain ideas during early Christianity, which interpret the resurrection symbolically, as exemplified by Docetism or Manichaeism. And considering this, early theologians refuted such interpretations by using scripture, asserting that the resurrection was biblically perceived as a real bodily event, not merely a symbolic one. And they argued that the resurrection was foretold first by the law and the prophets, and subsequently confirmed by the New Testament. And indeed, Christians primarily reference the New Testament when discussing teachings on resurrection. However, these concepts are not confined to the New Testament alone. They're part of more extensive biblical tradition that culminated in the New Testament writings, suggesting widespread acceptance of such idea at a time. And this indicates that the concept of resurrection was already embedded within the people's faith. And the most effective approach to tracing this development is to surely examine beliefs about resurrection in the Old Testament writings. But prior to that exploration, I will try to offer a very brief overview of similar beliefs and ideas in the ancient world. I hope you guys can still hear me. We go on the next slide. And now when it comes to confronting death, that terrifying moment of life ends has largely preoccupied all ancient cultures. So the numerous systems of the afterlife were created along with pantheons of underworld deities in an attempt for humanity to interpret and respond to the mystery of death. And because of a time limit, I will only try shortly to run through some examples. So first one would be the Canaanite religion, where the idea of the resurrection of the god Baal is present, which required a conduction of many proper rituals to happen. And however, of course, the notion of the human resurrection was absent. And because in terms of that, ordinary humans were tasked with conducting proper ritual offerings to ensure their soul could endure the stay in the underworld. Now, Egyptian religion brings similar ideas, but it introduces the Elysium, a third realm of the existence after the world of the living, the world of the death. And it was firstly reserved for the resurrected god Osiris, and later it started to include all human beings, firstly starting with the royals and the heroes. Nevertheless, resurrection was possibly only upon the performance of the proper burial rituals, that is mummification, which then assured that the resurrected existed in the Elysium as a sort of a mummy doppelganger. And it appears that the resurrection was seen as a necessity of the nature, and similarly to the Canaanite notion, it is afforded to those for whom the correct rituals have been executed. Now, concerning ancient Greek conception of the afterlife, it may be divided into three distinct stages of the evolution of the idea. We have the pre-Homeric period, Homeric period, and the age of philosophers, so to say. So concerning the first period, very little to none is known, other than the assumptions that the dead were perceived as smoky-like shadows dwelling in the tombs or beneath the homes. But any idea of their return to the realm of the living is excluded. Now, Homeric age, which strongly influenced even later Hellenistic period, is more or less clear concerning afterlife. As Achilles said in Iliad, the soul of a man cannot come back again. So after that, proper burial ritual had to be conducted so that the soul could reach Hades, from which there is no return. And when it comes to philosophers, Plato's great synthesis is here of great importance. In short, idea of resurrection was completely unimaginable and obscure because the body was seen as a prison of soul, and the souls who returned to the body was actually seen as a punishment for the immoral and sinful life. So the goal is for the soul to break the bodily chains, and as in Plato's myth of Er in his Republic, to join the company of God. So the closest idea, however, to the concept of resurrection may have been noticed within the so-called Greek mystery cults, such as Eleusinian or Orphic mysteries, but we don't have much time to dwell into that realm, and secondly, because of their secretive character, one cannot be entirely sure about their exact ideas. one of the rare examples of returning from Hades is Euripides' play Alcestis, where the wife of the king Admetus died for her husband and was later rescued from Hades by the god hero Heracles. Nevertheless, the idea of resurrection from the dead, as I said, was generally seen as problematic and blasphemous. And for example, in the Alcestis, Euripides writes about Asclepius, who was accused for blasphemy for his attempt to raise the dead, so that Zeus had to kill him. Now, concerning the angle of observation, the faith of resurrection in the Old Testament can be seen either as very complicated or very simple. Adherents of the second approach would simply say that the idea is completely absent. They would say that Job 7:9-10 claim that those who go to Sheol won't go up, and that, for example, Psalm 88:5 laments that God does not remember those in graves. I would, however, rather join the first approach, underlying that if God breathed the breath of life into humans, Genesis 2:7, and as it was mentioned here today, this breath will return to God according to Ecclesiastes 12:7, then the death cannot be the final farewell between the Creator and his creation. Yes, it is true that the main focus of the Old Testament is on the long and blessed life, as it was mentioned, and that a specific resurrection terminology is missing. Nevertheless, the resurrection imagery, and I would say the very idea with it, is all but not absent. Of course, because of the limitation of time, I will focus here only on some few examples, especially from the book of Isaiah, Ezekiel, and book of Daniel. But first, it shouldn't be overseen that the idea that a God can revive those who died is present in the book of Kings, with the examples of resurrections within the Elijah-Elisha narratives and the aforementioned quote from Deuteronomy that God is the one who kills and revives. Now, concerning the book of Isaiah, interesting is the so-called Isaiah Apocalypse, which emerged most likely sometimes in the late 7th century BC. And in the second part of chapter 26, which consists of victory songs, verses 1-6, and lament of the people, that reminds a lot to Psalms, verses 7-21, Isaiah 26:19 expresses the faith that Yahweh's dead will live and that corpses will rise up, and calls those who dwell in the dust to wake up. On the other hand, Isaiah 26:14 clearly wants to show that the enemies of Yahweh will die and won't live and won't rise up. So many voices, of course, opt here for metaphorical language, which prophet uses in order to point to the national resurrection, salvation of Jewish community after a painful period of problems and slavery. However, most ancient readers, and especially Septuagint's tradition, point to the real expectation of the resurrection from the dead. Nevertheless, if one would somehow accept the theory of symbolic national restoration, again, the resurrection imagery, and especially this one, suggests that such belief was in a way present in Israel's society. The second most interesting passage concerning the resurrection in the book of Isaiah is the passage, of course, about the suffering servant from Isaiah 53, Lord, suffering servant. And because having willingly suffered for his message and giving his life for the benefit of others, the passage concludes with the strong allusion to the reward beyond death. And of course, it cannot with certainty be concluded that this reward is actually resurrection, but connection with martyrdom, and especially later reception, as in Daniel, and above all in the New Testament. I believe that's the book of Acts 8:20 something further on, strongly points to such understanding of the Isaiah 53. Another interesting passage is Ezekiel's vision from Ezekiel 37 about the valley full of dry bones. Of course, the vision opens with Ezekiel being brought by the hand of God into a valley filled with the dry bones. God then instructs Ezekiel to prophesy the bones, causing them to reassemble, grow tissues, and stand up. And after that, the breath of God enters them and they become alive. So it seems that Ezekiel here reuses the imagery of the creation narrative from the Genesis 2:7 when he describes this scene. Firstly, bones described as dry and scattered, which strongly emphasize their lifelessness, are brought back together, and flesh and skin are added to them. And after that, breath or spirit of God came into them, and they were alive. And of course, for the most of modern scholars, this Ezekiel's vision is also metaphorical and refers to the national restoration of the politically defeated Israel. However, the multiple usage of the word grave may point at least to the present of the idea of the possibility of bodily resurrection somewhere in the faith of the recipients, and of course having in mind, as I mentioned with Isaiah, the later reception and the presence of the resurrection imagery, as mentioned before, it may be concluded that such ideas were developed already and present already in the 6th century BC. Speaking of resurrection in the Old Testament, book of Daniel undoubtedly comes to mind first, and its apocalyptic context during the great persecutions of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, together with the martyrdom. Daniel 12:3 develops the concept of resurrection further and puts it in an eschatological scenario. So along with Isaiah, Daniel brings the hope for the reward in the afterlife for those who gave their lives for their faith, and in a way uses and develops further motives from, I would say, Isaiah 53. So Daniel writes that the righteous, Hamaskilim, will awake to the everlasting life, while there will be those who will awake to the everlasting shame and judgment. So he does not elaborate further neither on how does the resurrection looks like, nor the punishment of the sinners. However, given the linguistical connection with Isaiah 26:19, it is completely possible to assume that Daniel understood it as a bodily resurrection and not some symbolic. And according to J.J. Collins, it is the only generally accepted reference to the resurrection in the Old Testament. And it seems that the concept of resurrection was very well known to the recipients, so that the writer did not have to elaborate it further. And therefore, it looks like that Daniel inherits the faith clearly present in Isaiah, but also in other mentioned passages, and opens the way for a clearer and more explicit confession, but again, also contextual, of the same faith by the mother and her sons in 2 Maccabees 7. This way, it may be evident that the faith in resurrection did not appear only as a result of the persecution of the Jews during the Hellenistic period, or as a copying of the different Egyptian or Greek models, but its roots are spreading to much earlier times and generally deal primarily with the theological question of the hope of the permanent communion with God. Now, turning to the 2 Maccabees, following and extending the theological discourse, I'd say, of Isaiah 53 and possibly even Daniel 12, 2 Maccabees articulates the belief in resurrection of the dead more explicitly than any other pre-New Testament text. Unlike Daniel, where affirmation and resurrection are wrapped in visions, 2 Maccabees presents them in distinct real-life scenarios described in the language of historical narrative and involving concrete events and individuals, in our case, the tortured martyrs, and we'll see if we have time to cover Judas and his fallen comrades from 2 Maccabees 12. The historical context of the mentioned chapters encompasses a gruesome chain of Syrian wars and later rebellions, devastating destructions, fallen soldiers, and above all, the deaths of the innocent. So the gruesome reality of war. For the Jews of that era who lived in constant anticipation of the next ruthless worldly power which will come to conquer their land, life must have felt utterly hopeless. So initially it was Assyrians, then Babylonians, then the Persians and Alexander, and then a century of bloodshed among Alexander's successors, and of course then the uprisings with no resolution in sight. And for these reasons, the prophecies of Daniel emerged. Similarly, the words of the prophet Isaiah, the prophecies of the suffering servant, and even those of Ezekiel found resonance as beacons of hope for those who suffered. However, these were not understood as the creation of a new prophetic school or visions of national restoration. Instead, they affirmed that God, the creator of all, who made a covenant with Abraham, who rescued the widow's son and embraced Elijah, would not forsake his people during the horrible times. He would restore life to those who remain faithful, thereby providing a heavenly reward to the martyr. As expected and attested later by the text in the New Testament, the author of 2nd Maccabees predominantly uses the verb anistimi and the noun anastasis to denote resurrection. Additionally, in 2 instances, the verb apodidimi is combined with the adverb palin to articulate bringing back of life to the deceased. And interestingly, except in 2nd Maccabees 14:33, the verb anistimi refers exclusively to resurrection. And given the author's artistry, craftsmanship, and ability to get in clash with Greek culture, it may not be coincidental that the usage of anistimi in 2nd Maccabees 14:33 appears in a word of Seleucid general who intends to raise up a temple to Dionysus in place of temple of Yahweh, Yahweh who raises up the dead. Of course, undertaking Nicanor ultimately fails. Furthermore, of course, the usage of anistimi is also found in the Septuagint. For example, Hosea 6:2, Isaiah 26:19, and particularly in Daniel 12:2, denoting the idea of resurrection, suggesting also the idea that the author of 2nd Maccabees continues the Old Testament tradition, and simultaneously almost every application of anistimi in context of resurrection in Greek literature, it serves to mock it or to deny it. Now, revisiting mentioned chapter 7 and the narrative of the martyrdom of the mother and her 7 sons, it is evident that they professed their faith in resurrection amidst torture during the persecutions of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. So, after rebelling against the Seleucid officials in Jerusalem, broke out something similar to the civil war, which King Antiochus, king of the Seleucid Empire, put down with a brutal force, abolishing all the previous benefits to the Jews established by his father Antiochus III the Great. Now, 2nd Maccabees 7 brings a story of a Jewish mother and her 7 sons who were arrested and tortured by the Seleucid government, in the text by the king himself, for refusing to eat pork in violation of their religious law, and for refusing to accept Antiochus as the Epiphanate god. Each son in turn is brutally executed and courageously affirmed their faith and rejecting the king's command in their speeches, and the mother supports and encourages her sons to remain steadfast in their beliefs, even in the face of death. So she reminds them of their duty to God and the hope, reminds them of the hope of the expectation of the resurrection. And after witnessing the deaths of all her sons, the mother also meets her death with dignity. And now explicit expression of faith are found in the speeches of the 2nd and the 4th son, verses 9 and 14, as well as in the mother words, verse 23. Additionally, allusions to resurrection, though not directly mentioned, appear in the speeches of the 3rd and 7th brother, verses 11 and 36, as well as in the 2nd speech of the mother, verse 29. Now, concretely to text, following the terrifying description of the execution of the 1st brother, the narrative shifts to the 2nd brother, who undergoes also a brutal torture, after which he's compelled to consume forbidden meat. Upon his steadfast refusal, the torture intensifies, and just before he was about to die, he said to his torturers, and the verse goes like this: "You wretch, you release us from our present living, but the King of the universe will raise us up, us who died for the sake of his laws, to revival of eternal life." So in this passage, one can recognize, firstly, antithesis structured around the usage of Mandey construction, which serves to contrast King Antiochus, the wretch, Alastor, who governs the present earthly life of the brothers with God, Otokosmo Vasilevs, who oversees life in both its present and eternal form. So This theme appears to develop further from a hint in maybe 2 Maccabees 6:26 to 27, where it is stated that the tortured Eleazar, whether alive or dead, cannot escape the hands of the Almighty. The Almighty will resurrect the righteous. Hence, in this narrative, God is the subject of resurrection and the faithful are its object. They are resurrected not due to cosmic necessity or the will of the heroes, as in the case of mentioned Euripides' play Alcestis, but through the will and mercy of God. Furthermore, the word anaviosis, which is attested only here within biblical literature, is intended to depict the afterlife or resurrection as something transcendent, that is, without any temporal determination. And this subtly contrasts on a first look with Daniel 12, which places resurrection within an eschatological framework. However, the distinction is understandable given that Daniel is framed as a prophetic vision while 2 Maccabees is shaped as a narrative. Nonetheless, delusion and wordplay are evident, as both Daniel 12:2 and 2 Maccabees 7:9 refer to the resurrection is zoin eonon, for those chamaskelim who adhered to God's law. In essence, the author of 2 Maccabees seeks to align with the biblical tradition that also inspired and gave birth to these passages in the book of Daniel. Following the death of the second brother and the subsequent torture and demise of the third, the author of 2 Maccabees continues in a similar style to describe the terrifying and horrifying end of the fourth brother. After enduring severe torment and nearing his death, the fourth brother defied his executioners by saying, "It is better to pass away because of humans, while from God expecting the hope again to being raised by him. But for you, king, there will be no resurrection into life." So similar to the previous speech, an antithesis is evident here also. Those martyred and murdered by humans harbor hope for resurrection by God, whereas the king and his accomplices who persecuted the innocent will have no resurrection into life. If the prior verse suggests an illusion, this verse shares definitely the same background with Daniel 2. The only distinction is that Daniel speaks of everlasting shame as a counterpart to eternal life, while 2 Maccabees remains silent about Antiochus's fate after lack of resurrection. It might be assumed that the author of 2 Maccabees thinks of eternal and ultimate death as the opposition or as opposed of resurrection. However, the echoes of Daniel 12:2 might have been clear enough in the minds of the readers that repeating both clauses would have been superfluous. Nonetheless, it is not hard to imagine that everlasting shame actually represents death as the complete disappearance and even the antithesis to resurrection. Moreover, the similarity of this notion with Psalm 1:5-6, which states, "The Lord knows the way of the righteous, and the way of the impious will perish," is hard to overlook, and the allusion to Isaiah 26:14, where the punished dead won't live, and Isaiah mentioned Isaiah 26:19, wherein God's dead will live, is also evident. And this theme of eternal life and eternal punishment reappears later in the New Testament, notably in Matthew, I believe it's 25:46, and as you can see here, John 5:29, possibly with 2 Maccabees 7:9 and 14 in mind. So this portrayal of the doomed fate of oppressors and persecutors also resonates with one of the final segments of the book of Jeremiah, where the prophet declares the ultimate downfall of Babylon, stating they will sleep eternal sleep and never wake up, Jeremiah 51, implying there is no resurrection for them. So all these elements unequivocally underscore that 2 Maccabees maintains its biblical heritage, building some sort of a bridge between the Christian Old and New Testament. And the additional nuance in this verse is a representation of resurrection, not as predestined certainty, a cosmic necessity, even for the martyrs who suffered justly, but rather as a hope, a peace. And this hope is in God and his mercy that he will resurrect them. This hope is not characterized by irrational unreasonable optimism, as German theologian Eberhard Bones concluded through an analysis of ancient perceptions of emotions. Such hope in ancient world is actually based on observation, experience, and knowledge. And in essence, it is a hope rooted in a steadfast faith in God and communion with Him through His law. The narrative then transitioned to description of the details of deaths of other brothers, setting the stage for the mother's first speech, encouraging her son not to forsake God's law. And the mother says the verse that you can hear see on the screen. So the mother begins to profess her faith by acknowledging that God is the one who created and gave life to her sons, which echoes Psalm 139:13, where the psalmist declares, "For it was you who formed my inward parts, you put me together in my mother's womb." And she further praises God as the ultimate creator of the universe and all life within it, referring to him as "Otukos muktisis o plazas anthropu genesin." So she affirms that it is through his mercy that he gives back life and spirit to those who died for his law. Notably, such designation of God resonates with Genesis 2:7, reflecting the creation narrative where God is the designer of plazas, that is the creator of origin and genesis of humans. And in Genesis 2:7, God created eplasen, human, and human became a geneto, a living soul. So furthermore, God will bring back again life, zoe, and spirit, pneuma, that may be a direct reference to the breathing of the breath of life, pnoin zois, into Adam in Genesis 2:7, especially because the Hebrew word neshama was often synonymously translated in Septuagint with pneuma and pnoi. Therefore, these linguistic nuances indicate that the mother may have had Genesis account in mind while encouraging her sons, and this connection further suggests that the concept of resurrection is closely linked with the idea of creation, as will be repeated later in 2 Maccabees 7:28-29. So since God created a world, he possessed the capability to restore her son's life, positioning resurrection as a form of new creation. And this perspective likely resonated with readers familiar with Ezekiel 37, especially given the phrase from Ezekiel 37:10, which states that breath entered the dead and that they lived. Additionally, it is crucial to highlight, to emphasize the notion here that God resurrects through his mercy and grace, so the resurrection is not some necessity of nature. Looking at the time, I'll just shortly here mention the speech of a third brother who expresses hope of receiving his cutted limbs, tongue, and hands back from God. So he sees, so here we can have a clear declaration of faith in the resurrection, even in the absence of typical resurrection terminology. So the third brother envisions life after death as similar to this life, where he will regain his limbs, clearly indicating his belief in a bodily resurrection. And all this seems strikingly to parallel Ezekiel 37:2-10, where God reassembles and resurrects his people from the valley of scattered bones. And it seems almost impossible not to assume that the author of 2 Maccabees had Ezekiel in mind when depicting both the death and the mutilation and the fate proclamation of the third brother. Because of the time pressure, I will now skip chapter 12. But here is interesting one thing, that it seems that the resurrection is not something that happens immediately, but it's something that's expected. It does not happen again, but it aligns a bit more with Daniel, as if resurrection has not yet occurred, but it will happen in the future. And of course, we have, if you want, later, if you have time, you can read this 2 Maccabees 12:44 and compare it with the mentioned Paul's quote from the first letter to Corinthians, which are strikingly similar, because Judas says, if there is no resurrection, then it would be silly to pray for those who died. Similarly, Paul says, if there's no resurrection, then Christ has not been risen. If Christ has not been risen, then all our preaching and faith is in vain. Now, Wrapping up, I'd like to mention Professor Mark Finney from the University of Sheffield and his conclusion concerning the discussion in the resurrection in Second Maccabees, where he suggested that the notion of bodily resurrection is highly questionable and that the author, influenced by Greek thought and philosophy, actually had the resurrection of the soul in mind. Thus, the author would align himself with those Greeks who believed in immortality and eternity of the soul, and given the tendencies to categorize Second Maccabees as merely another Hellenistic Greek word with slight Jewish influence, as Professor Bezalel Bar Kochva from the Tel Aviv University does, such a conclusion seems logical. However, this brief analysis has illuminated distinct differences between the Greek perspectives and that of Second Maccabees. So the author of Second Maccabees, in my opinion, consistently opposes Greek views. In this case of the faith of resurrection, and even more in some other instances. When he writes in perfect Greek, and he's knowledgeable about figures such as Homer, Socrates, Euripides, and he utilizes their motives, but he remains fundamentally Jewish. For him, the soul is not eternal. It is created by God alongside the body, as in Genesis 2:7, and for those who died adhering to God's law, he articulates hope and resurrection, not merely as continuation of the soul's existence somewhere in a realm of gods, but as a future bodily resurrection, likely in an alignment with Daniel, and though not explicitly stated, positioned at the end of time. For this very reason, early church theologian Methodius of Olympus in the 3rd century used examples from Second Maccabees to argue that resurrection is bodily and not just spiritual or symbolic. So the author of Second Maccabees does not invent concept of resurrection because of the terrors during the persecution of Antiochus, but inherits it from a rich scriptural tradition, frequently alluding himself to texts such as Book of Isaiah, Book of Ezekiel, maybe Psalms, possibly even Daniel, and he perceives life as a divine gift, believing firmly that God will not abandon his people even in death. And the historical context that prompted the author of Ecclesiastes to declare that all things are vanity also provided a fertile ground for revisiting fundamental questions about life and death. And in such an environment, the author of Second Maccabees interprets mentioned biblical passages as beacons of hope in the world of constant death and terror, thus offering examples of those who lived and died for this hope, both the martyrs and, as in chapter 12 that we didn't cover today, sinful soldiers. So such times provided an explicit and clear expressions of faith and resurrection. And without this faith, the acts of the martyrs would be reduced to mere magical rituals intended to appease deities, as it was the case with the Greek tradition. And the fact that the author of Second Maccabees does not need to elaborate on how exactly resurrection works suggests that many of his readers were already familiar with the concept. It had been deeply rooted in their faith through the mentioned biblical text. This indicates that the Maccabean faith in resurrection is faith of the people. It's folk's faith, so to say, inherited from the Old Testament text. And the emphasized faith in Second Maccabees provides a clear testimony, and in my opinion, paves the way for many to recognize and embrace Christ, his message, and most crucially for Christians, his resurrection from the dead. So therefore, it may be assumed that the faith in resurrection as presented in the New Testament is in a way continuation of this very Maccabean faith. Maccabean, and of course, under quotation marks. So thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you so much.
I will
Alex,
just try to stop. How do I stop screen sharing? Oh, never mind.
Okay. Are you gonna stop this screen sharing?
Yeah, just to find out how to do that.
Maybe the
Or if maybe you can close it. Okay. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
Great. Once again, thank you so much, Alex, for your great presentation as always. And yeah, we can continue directly to the discussion. There is already a response and a question from Helmut here, and I'll read it. So regarding your paper, Salvation in Maccabees is still based on biblical tradition, primarily seen in Isaiah and Daniel. Some additions also come from Ezekiel. 2 Maccabees 7 verse 9 clearly states that the foundation is necessary. That foundation is his laws. We might think that this resurrection could be similar to our current physical life, but it could also be spiritual because Isaiah 26:14-19 mentions the erasure of memory. However, there will always be two final outcomes. Either there is a resurrection or there is no resurrection at all, and it will certainly be eternal. And 2 Maccabees 7:23 says that God will raise the dead, for he is the one who created everything. Please correct me if I'm wrong. My question relates to the New Testament. I believe that Jesus also said the same thing in some of his parables. There are those that are burned and those that are stored in barns, among other parables, with the same essence. So the question is, why is it now that Jesus is the foundation, which is also said to be in accordance with his laws, as taught by most Christian scholars? Okay, please.
Okay, this is actually a question more for the New Testament scholars, so I wouldn't dare to freestyle now a lot concerning answering this question. Maybe some few thoughts that I have, but in a way, yes. So as you mentioned here, Isaiah does have this conception, but it is of course debatable. Does the prophet himself speaks about the concrete resurrection, prophesies the concrete resurrection idea or the national restoration using the language that recipients could understand very well, because that was part of their it was part of their faith. And 2 Maccabees 7:23 intentionally connects, and as it can be read later in verse 28, intentionally connects these two things, because 2 Maccabees 7:28 says that the God who is capable of creating world out of nothing, ekoxondon, ex nihilo, which is not that clear if you read Genesis 1 and 2, or especially if you read later Psalms or further wisdom literature. Here it is said that if God has capability of creating everything, then he can also resurrect the dead. He can that what was died. He can breathe again the breath of life to those individuals. And now, just part of my notions, why is now the Jesus the foundation? At least in Christian understanding, Jesus is Christ. He's the Messiah. He is the Son of God. That is, he is in Trinitarian understanding, second person of the Holy Trinity. He's God himself. So maybe that's the reason why he's the foundation. But of course, I'm not a New Testament scholar. I don't deal deeply with the dogmatic theology, either Protestant, Catholic, or Orthodox. So I wouldn't dare now to comment a lot of that. But yeah, the premises are really, really interesting. And thank you for the message and for the question.
Thank you, Alex, for your answer. I hope that would answer the question. And we still open other questions from the audience about the presentation today regarding the resurrection in this book of the Second Maccabees. Okay, is there any other questions? Okay, yes, please.
I have a question to you about Maccabees era. I know that the Syrian war also be a part of Israelites suffer. Why they suffer? Because they are because of that war between Seleucid and Ptolemies. And because of their suffer, I think some the writers of the Maccabees is trying to tell the Israelites that we may be suffer because of war, but I mean, if we comment His law, whatever happened to us, we will He will resurrect resurrect us, and if we comment His laws, we have eternal life with Him. But my question is, in New Testament, in New Testament, Israelites become a slave, maybe a slave of Roman Empire, and they have a similar condition about because of that. So why? I mean, about the resurrection according to Old Testament. I mean, biblical tradition from Old Testament. When someone believe in that, it's become a truth for him, and even when he don't believe in Jesus, I mean, he doesn't believe that Jesus is a Messiah. He still got a truth, and they still have a resurrection. So that's is my.
Okay.
Is that okay about that?
So can you just repeat can you just repeat the last sentence?
Yeah, I mean, it's okay if you believe that resurrection according to the biblical tradition from Old Testament, and if you don't believe in Jesus as a Messiah, it's okay, because this is from the Bible too, from the Bible tradition. So you still have a resurrection, because Christianity tells about the resurrection, because believing in Jesus Christ.
First, thank you very much for an interesting notion here, and an interesting conclusion and question, and kind of, you, in my opinion now, of course, you kind of gave the answer yourself. Of course, I'm not an expert to the later Jewish theology, but as I mentioned, the Talmud also holds for very important the idea of the belief in resurrection, and it is said those who do not believe in resurrection won't inherit the world to come. In my opinion, they base that idea, that thinking, also and mainly on the mentioned Old Testament passages, mind you, excluding Second Maccabees, because so-called Deuterocanonicals or Apocrypha or late writings of the New Testament, which of Second Maccabees is part, is not accepted within the Jewish community in the first centuries, up, of course, until this day. Lately, because of the recent political situations, they do reuse now the books of Maccabees, but generally, yes, they inherit the Old Testament tradition. And my idea was here to try to say the following: when Christians, when we look at from the perspective of Christians, when Christ appeared, and when the events of the New Testament occurred and happened, the resurrection wasn't something that fell from the sky, that was new, that was because if it was, they could not have understood it. they had in their own scripture, the people of the first century, the followers of Jesus, and of course the opponents, they had in their own scripture, starting from the Torah, concluding with prophets, this faith and this idea. And Second Maccabees shows us how could have some read the Old Testament ideas about the resurrection. Of course, the mentioned Kohelet or Ecclesiastes is another dimension where the resurrection, okay, Jenry says, if I'm not mistaken, is completely excluded. I would say the Kohelet is not even much interested in that. He said the spirit came from God, it'll be back to God, and that's it. That faith that was present in the Old Testament, which we can see here in the Second Maccabees, especially in the Second Maccabees 7, in a way shaped and opened the possibility for the people to accept Christ, Jesus as a Christ, as a Messiah, and his resurrection as a real event. But of course, there were others who did not interpret it that way. I have no idea if I answered to your question, but these are some thoughts that I have on what you said.
Yeah. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for the answer and also the question as well from Helmut. And yeah, since this is the last session, I think it is okay for us to extend 5 minutes because I have one question for Alex. Because you know,
please
doing...
just don't make it hard.
The question wouldn't be hard, but I think I've already asked you before. But since the discussion was in Germany and it was in German as well, I think it would be a good opportunity for you to explain it to the audience here. And my question would be, how do you categorize this type of literature in the Second Maccabee about the resurrection? So it is certainly not an apocalyptic literature, and we already discussed it before. But since the idea of resurrection is one of the main ancient Jewish apocalyptic notion, how do you connect it with the Jewish apocalyptic?
Yeah, actually, that's a great question. I don't deal with it much because it's not in the center of my research. But generally, yes, as you said, as you can see, Second Maccabees, when you read the book, it's not it doesn't look like a prophetic book. There aren't visions, there aren't such themes and topics that are characteristic for the apocalyptic literature, but it may be the best exemplifier of the impact apocalyptic literature has made, maybe in a way, at that time, because here we have a book that tends to be history, most likely was used as some form of a school book, as a counterpart to the vastly Greek literature that slowly started to enter the Jewish community of that time, especially through the Hellenization process and so on and so forth. And it shows that the apocalyptic ideas were present, and they did not have to be didn't have to be unconditionally, shaped in some prophetic, and when we say apocalyptic scenario, it shows that what the apocalyptic literature, especially Daniel, wrote in that genre was also expressed further in some other genres this year, either history or a school book or a textbook. I had no idea if I answered you, but yeah.
I think that was a great answer. So we would define it as a different type of genre of literature.
Definitely, but influenced, definitely influenced by the apocalyptic ideas.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Alex, once again, for your answers, for your presentation for today. And the last part of this session is the appreciation that we would like to present to you. Small appreciation with certificate of appreciation from us.
Oh, thank you very much. Oh, my name is so long, you cannot put it rightly.
It's okay. So we'll send it to you directly.
Thank you. Thank you.
And yeah, so that's it for today. This is the last session for conference, international conference on biblical studies, and we'll continue directly to the end session, which is the closing of this conference. And I would like to invite Dr. Sri Mulyani to lead it. Thank you so much.